For the very generous introduction. I want to just sort of start off by saying that I have a cold, so I'm going to do my best to project, but if you can't hear me, just let me know and I will stand over here by the microphone. Before I get started, I want to give a big thank you to my co-authors, Jennifer Barber, Mark Zimmerman, Justin Hines, and Yasmin Kusinoki at the University of Michigan. Today's talk is part of a larger, I already lost this. Part of a larger project that examines the consequences of neighborhood violence on the transition to adulthood. But specifically today, I'm going to be talking about the effects of neighborhood homicides, specifically on pregnancy and its proximate determinants, sex and contraceptive use. The big takeaway for today's talk and from the broader project that examines the effects of neighborhood violence on a range of outcomes is that even if neighborhood homicides have a temporary or fleeting effect on behavior, given this time of life course, these consequences can have a rippling effect that extend throughout the remainder of the life course. So thinking about outcomes beyond pregnancy to include things like progression into cohabitation or college enrollment or college dropout, for example. So as many of you in this room probably already know, homicide and violence exposure varies greatly with race and class in the United States. Black urban Americans are more than twice as likely to be exposed to a neighborhood homicide than the average urban American. At the same time, homicides are highly correlated with racial segregation. So what this means is that even within the African American population, those living in more racially segregated neighborhoods are also disproportionately exposed to homicides. Homicides are also concentrated in disadvantaged neighborhoods, meaning those that are marked by high unemployment rates, high rates of poverty and other indicators of resource deprivation, and that tend to exhibit lower community organization or cohesion, for instance, neighborhoods that have fewer number of NGOs, things like that. So very little research has been conducted on the relationship between community violence and late adolescence or early pregnancy, by which I mean pregnancy before the age of 24. In fact, I could only find 3 studies that take up this topic, and one of them finds a very strong correlation at the state level between homicide rates and teen pregnancy rates. So for people in this room who are not familiar with disparities in early fertility, they map on almost directly to disparities in homicide exposure. Women who are from disadvantaged backgrounds, who grow up poor, or who are Black or Hispanic are disproportionately likely to have a pregnancy before the age of 24 compared to white women and women who come from comparatively more advantaged backgrounds. So to me, this begs the question, does neighborhood violence or neighborhood homicides actually contribute to the risk of early fertility? Or is this simply a case of 2 phenomena having the same demographic correlates and the same sort of antecedents? Most of the research on the effects of neighborhood homicides and violence more broadly has been conducted among children and adolescents. Since you have Pat Sharkey here at the OPR, I assume that a lot of you are already familiar with some of this research. But for instance, studies indicate that when young children are exposed to a neighborhood homicide, they are more likely to act impulsively in the subsequent week, and they are also more likely to exhibit externalizing behaviors. Children who are exposed to neighborhood violence also perform worse on school tests, and they exhibit poor cognitive outcomes in the immediate aftermath of a homicide. On a broader scale, being exposed to higher levels of violence within your community is also associated with a higher likelihood of dropping out or repeating a grade. Among both adolescents and older adults, being exposed to violence is associated with subsequent poor mental health outcomes, including depression and PTSD. I have an asterisk here after substance use because all of the research I can find is correlational, but research also indicates a strong correlation with being exposed to community violence and school violence and substance use, including both alcohol and narcotic use. And the same thing with an asterisk after relationship violence. There are a number of correlational studies suggesting that both among adolescents and among older men who are residing in neighborhoods that they deem or perceive to be unsafe are more likely to report perpetrating some form of intimate partner violence than men who reside in communities that they deem safer. So thinking about this rich literature on neighborhood and community violence, but specifically on the potential impacts to the transition to adulthood, my co-authors and I wanted to sort of expand our theoretical horizons to include other demographic outcomes beyond those that I've just talked about. So for instance, so thinking about why the transition to adulthood. Developmental psychologists refer to the transition to adulthood as this key developmental stage in which the frontal lobe is still developing, but it's almost done. So what this means ultimately is that compared to children and adolescents, young adults who are in this transition should be relying more on the rational part of their brain. They're better able to do logical thinking and make firmer decisions relating to the future. At the same time, the frontal lobe is not done developing, which means that they are still slightly more prone to making illogical decisions and impulsive behaviors than relatively older adults. At the same time, in the United States, the transition to adulthood is characterized by a dense concentration of social and sexual experimentation. So what this means is that young adults starting around the age of 18 typically go on to move out of the house, whether they're moving in with friends or they're going off to college, they're starting new jobs, new relationships, etc. And these new experiences have a large bearing on their attitudes and their subsequent trajectories in ways that may ultimately impact future advantage and disadvantage down the road. So we think the transition to adulthood is a particularly important period to think about neighborhood homicides and their consequences for broader life course trajectories. So with that in mind, my co-authors and I asked, does homicide exposure increase the risk of early pregnancy? And if so, what are the behavioral mechanisms that could explain this? I'm sorry, this seems to be on automatic, so it's moving ahead of me. So the basic model of the proximate determinants of fertility as outlined by John Bongartz posits that the most obvious way in which a woman gets pregnant is she has sex, and that sex is not contracepted. Our model is saying, okay, does homicide affect sex and or contraceptive use in a way that ultimately causes an increased risk of pregnancy? So John Bongartz also has this broader model of the distal determinants. So those are the environmental factors that contribute to the proximate behaviors that result in a woman's risk of pregnancy. In this case, drawing on that literature that I just reviewed on the effects of neighborhood violence and homicide exposure, we propose this bigger theoretical model where homicide potentially affects young adults' impulsivity in a way that would ultimately undermine self-efficacy. By self-efficacy, I mean a woman's ability to do the onerous task of repeatedly using contraception. So for instance, if she's taking birth control pills, she needs to take it every day, roughly around the same time, in order for it to be effective. Or if she's using a condom, she needs to use a condom, or she needs her partner to use a condom every single time she's having sex in order to be effective. We think that homicides could have a potential effect on impulsivity in a way that undermines this efficacy. At the same time, it's also possible that homicides affect substance use, and substance use may ultimately also undermine efficacy. Likewise, homicide may affect relationship dynamics, including relationship violence, that also may be driven by substance use or impulsivity. But these relationship dynamics, and especially relationship violence, may undermine a woman's sexual agency or reproductive agency even in the short term. Drawing on research not about homicides or neighborhood violence, but on mortality exposures in general, we also think there's a possibility that homicides lead to what we call proximity seeking. In the psychological literature, proximity seeking is the idea that when we are faced with human frailty or our own mortality, we tend to seek comfort in others and in human interactions. So in terms of pregnancy, this may play out in one of two ways. It may be the case that women are exposed to homicide, they go on to have sex more often because they're seeking some sort of intimacy, and this could ultimately result in pregnancy. Alternatively, It may be the case that women want to either start a family or expand their family after they're exposed to a homicide. Through childbearing, they might be seeking some sort of comfort in human connection. And lastly, it's really easy to imagine that being exposed to a neighborhood homicide affects a woman's sense of safety and or her physical mobility. So if a woman, for instance, experiences a homicide in her neighborhood, she may decide that it's not safe for her in the immediate aftermath to go to the pharmacy to get condoms or to refill her birth control prescription. Or alternatively, we could imagine a scenario where a homicide occurs in her neighborhood and she flees her house and she goes somewhere else, to a friend's house, her parents' house, wherever, and she leaves her house quickly without her birth control, and then she has to go a couple of days without taking it. This may also compromise the effectiveness of the birth control. Finally, we can imagine that all of these different mechanisms are interrelated, and whether they're interrelated or not, each of them should affect sex and contraception in a way that results in an increased risk of pregnancy. So, before I get to the data and methods, I just want to reiterate that my talk today is specifically on sex, contraception, and pregnancy, but I'm happy to answer questions in the Q&A about these other mechanisms. The ones with asterisks here, self-efficacy, relationship dynamics, and proximity seeking, we're currently exploring as part of this bigger project. So we are testing our conceptual model by combining weekly panel survey data with administrative data on homicides in Flint, Michigan. So the weekly panel data come from the Relationship Dynamics and Social Life study. This study was conducted in the state of Michigan, specifically in Genesee County, where Flint is located. Flint has the 4th highest murder rate in the United States. Like Rochester, New York, where I grew up, it is a deindustrialized city that currently experiences very high rates of unemployment and major poverty. It's also a racially diverse city that has a pretty large African American population. So what this ultimately means for us is that given the high murder rate, we're able to exploit spatiotemporal variation in homicides occurring during the study period. And because it's racially diverse, we're also confident that we have a sizable African American population that may disproportionately be exposed to homicides. So the Relationship Dynamics and Social Life study rolled out in 2008 and 2009 and surveyed women who were ages 18 to 19 at baseline. These women were asked to participate in the study for up to 2.5 years, which ultimately means that during observation, all women were aged 18 to 22. They all had to be residing in, they all had to have a permanent residence in Genesee County to be selected into the sample, but they didn't have to actually be living there, and I'll talk more about that in a second. Women were randomly drawn from the state driver's license and ID card database, and we have a population representative sample. It looks just like the county as a whole, the sample. So one of the major benefits of having a geographically restricted sample is that it allowed the PI, Jennifer Barber, to follow these young women weekly for a very long period of time and to maintain contact. And if people were starting to drop off, she was able to send her data collectors out to go find them and to keep them in the study. Of course, the big drawback of having a geographically limited sample is the threat to external validity. So in comparison to the United States as a whole, Michigan looks very similar with respect to important family demographic outcomes like cohabitation and marriage rates, age at first birth, and completed family size. And when compared specifically to the RDSL, other nationally representative samples of women of the same age like the ACS and MSFG also look highly similar, especially with respect to school enrollment, employment, marriage rates, and residential arrangements like cohabitation, for instance. I should say, though, however, that the one key difference between the RDSL sample and nationally representative samples is racial. So given the high representation of African Americans in Flint and Genesee County, our sample has roughly twice as many African American women as you would expect in a nationally representative sample and about half as many Hispanic women. So the RDSL in 2008 and 2009 interviewed 1,003 women for about 50 minutes face-to-face. Women were paid $20 to complete This survey, in which they answered a large range of questions about their childhood background, their upbringing, their attitudes, their religion and religiosity, their relationship history, pretty much an exhaustive set of determinants of early pregnancy. At the end of the baseline, women were invited to participate in what we call the journal portion of the study. So for the remainder of the talk, I'll probably use the words journal and weeks interchangeably. Women completed these journals modally 8 days apart, so very close to 1 week apart. Women were paid $1 for every journal that they completed. They were incentivized to complete them on time by getting $5 additional every time they completed 5 journals in a row on time. 78% of women participated in the study for 1.5 years. 63% participated for 2.5 years. Attrition rates did vary slightly by race and socioeconomic status. So just to assuage any concerns about that, if we restrict the sample to the first year of observations, we find a similar pattern to those that I'm going to show you in a minute. It's worth noting that an experiment was conducted in conjunction with the RDSL that demonstrated no evidence of panel conditioning bias. So women were not, their behaviors and their attitudes weren't biased by repeatedly answering these questions. And in the weekly journal, each week women were asked to answer questions about their current pregnancy status, their relationship status and dynamics, their sexual behavior, and their contraceptive use. And finally, every 12 weeks, women were asked to update information about their demographic characteristics like employment, education, public welfare receipts, and they were also asked to update questions about their attitudes, perceptions of their social environment, other psychosocial indicators that might also affect a woman's risk of pregnancy. So this is just a timeline of what the RDSL looked like for the average participant. So at the first journal, she completes the baseline survey, and then she completes her first journal where she answers these questions about her relationship dynamics, pregnancy, sex, and contraceptive use. Every 4 weeks, she's asked to update her address, so we're able to track her location over time. And then every 12 weeks, she does these quarterly supplements updating her attitudes and demographics. The reason I bring up the fact that her address changes every 4 weeks is for 2 reasons. First of all, obviously, if a woman says that she's changed addresses here, we don't know specifically when this has happened, so we can do all kinds of sensitivity analyses where we omit these particular cases. The results remain the same. The other thing that's worth noting is that about half the women did move at least once during the study period. Some women moved 3 to 4 times. So we're able to sort of, as I'm going to describe in a minute, account for her movement within the city of Flint in a number of ways. So we restrict the sample specifically to women who completed at least 2 journals because we want to have some variation in her behavior and pregnancy status as well as homicide exposure. And then specifically looking at the journals in which a woman says she's residing in the city of Flint and when she's at risk of pregnancy. What I mean by at risk of pregnancy is a woman was not deemed by us to be pregnant, and then we sort of, as I'm going to describe in a second, estimate the week that we believe she conceived a pregnancy. That week is included in the sample, and all other weeks are discarded. This results in slightly more than 20,000 weeks from 507 women. So we define homicide exposure in our sample as a homicide that occurred within a quarter mile in the preceding 7 days before a woman completed her journal. 18% of women in our sample in Flint were ever exposed to a homicide within a quarter mile of their house. But these exposures were somewhat rare. We have only 134 weeks when a woman was ever exposed to a homicide. When you look at the demographic breakdown, it maps onto what you would expect looking at other cities in the United States like Chicago. So African American women were more than 3 times more likely to ever be exposed to a homicide during this 2.5-year period compared to white women and women of other racial groups. And when you look across 5 different socioeconomic indicators, so maternal education, maternal age at first birth, childhood family structure, childhood public assistance, and current public assistance at baseline, you see a pretty consistent pattern with women who are more disadvantaged being more likely to be exposed to homicide. And for those of you in the back, I've added these 3 little red umbrellas to show you which differences are significant. So the racial difference is significant. Women who were born to a teen mom and women who grew up in a single-parent household are significantly more likely than their peers to have been exposed to a homicide during the study period.
Could you remind us again how you're measuring homicide exposure?
Sure. So we take a woman's address in a given journal, and we map on all of the homicides that occurred in Flint during the study period. And we say, okay, she completed this journal on this date in this location, and then basically make a radius of a quarter mile and catch the net of homicides that could have occurred within that quarter mile. Does anyone else have any other questions? I'm rushing through this because the RDSL are like this massive data set with many indicators, and I would be loath to forget something. No? Okay. So in the RDSL, each week when a woman completed her journal, she was asked, are you pregnant? If she said yes, then she was asked, has a pregnancy test confirmed that you're pregnant? And then if she said yes, she was asked, what is your due date? So we take, and she was repeatedly asked her due date until she provided one. So we take the due date and walk it back 40 weeks, and then look around at the week before, current week, and week after to identify sexual activity, and then ascertain this is likely the week when she conceived the pregnancy. So in most cases, if you walked it back 40 weeks, the woman had sex that week, it was easy. There were a handful of cases where we said this can't be the week she conceived because she didn't have sex, so we move it 1 week forward or backward. As I already described, we write censor pregnancies, so a woman is coded 0 every single week until the week we believe she's conceived. Then she's coded 1, and then there are no more observations. She's not contributing observations unless she's at risk of pregnancy. As a robustness check, we've also looked at a second measure in which when a woman says that a pregnancy test has confirmed the pregnancy, we walk that back only 2 weeks because a pregnancy test can only confirm pregnancy 2 weeks post-conception. And the results are virtually identical to those I'm going to show you today. So just to give you a sense, as I mentioned already, the demographic correlates of these two phenomena, early pregnancy and homicide exposure, are very similar. You can see slightly higher rates of pregnancy during the study period among African American women compared to non-African American women. I'm sorry, this just keeps going so fast. And across all 5 indicators of socioeconomic disadvantage, we see a higher rate of pregnancy during the study period for the more disadvantaged women compared to the relatively advantaged women. And 4 of those socioeconomic indicators do vary significantly in terms of pregnancy rates during the study period. So in other words, the takeaway from these graphs is essentially that, yes, certainly there is a lot of demographic overlap in who's being exposed to homicide and who's getting pregnant during the study period. So just to talk quickly about the mechanisms, the proximate determinants of fertility. So in 32% of weeks when women completed journals, they said that they had sex, and by sex I specifically mean vaginal intercourse, so possibility of getting pregnant. Within those weeks when women had sex, 81% of the time they said they used any form of contraception. 37% of the time when they had sex, they said they specifically used some form of hormonal contraception. 65% of the time they said they used some form of coital contraception. So this included male, female condoms, and spermicide. I do want to say here for anyone who's thinking about this, that the 37% of hormonal contraceptors did include LARC usage, so long-acting reversible contraception. Those constituted such a minority of weeks that if we throw them out, it really doesn't matter. And finally, in weeks when women had sex and said they used any form of contraception, 72% of the time they said they used it consistently.
Does coital contraception include interruption?
Like withdrawal?
Yeah.
Mm-mm. No. Actually, so originally, I can talk more about this in the Q&A. Originally, I coded them together, and then I found that actually they're in contrasting directions. So this was not a useful strategy. We include a range of demographic and social environmental controls, all of which are time varying. If we remove these from the models, given concerns about potential mediation in a causal analysis, the results remain identical, so I'm not too concerned that these are mediating our effects. But I do want to take a minute to talk a little bit about the temporal and spatial controls that we include in our models. So in our models of pregnancy risk, we include a discrete indicator for the number of months that a woman has been at risk of pregnancy. Given the fact that the RDSL rolled out during the Great Recession, we also want to account for any potential secular trends that could be contributing to relationship dynamics, sex, contraceptive use, etc. So we include year and month dummies as well as interactions between them. And to account for the fact that some women move and they potentially move between census tracts, and we really want to isolate the effects of neighborhood homicides from other things that are happening in the neighborhood, we also include census tract dummies. So what I'm trying to tell you here is that we are estimating extremely conservative models accounting for variation across time, variation across space, and we're going to be looking at changes within the same woman over time. So this is actually the part that I'm hoping to get the most feedback on today. As I started off this talk by saying this is very much a work in progress. We have scanned the literature and consulted with multiple colleagues and cannot come up with a consensus for the best way to conduct a fixed effects model estimating the risk of pregnancy. So what we've settled on is a linear regression with fixed effects. Given the rarity of homicide exposure and the rarity of pregnancy, we cannot get a logistic regression with fixed effects to converge. But we're essentially estimating a discrete time linear hazard model with fixed effects. And as a robustness check, we're estimating linear regressions with random effects, logistic regression with random effects, and just logistic regression with no kind of effect. And I'll show you the results of all four, but they're pretty consistent across the different models. And then when we look at our proximate determinants of pregnancy, we again use linear regression with fixed effects. This causes less problems than it should with pregnancy because the distribution is somewhere between 20% and 80% pretty much across all of those outcomes. And as a robustness check, we also run logistic regressions with fixed effects and find the results to be the same. So for any early stage graduate students in the audience who aren't familiar with the concept of fixed effects, essentially we're estimating within women changes and averaging across women. So this really allows us to isolate the effects of homicide by taking into account all of the factors, the fixed factors in a woman's life that may predispose her to homicide exposure and to pregnancy during the transition to adulthood. This is just a visual representation essentially of what we're doing. So imagine that this is a woman in our data set. She starts participating at week 1, she continues to participate till week K, and a homicide happens somewhere in the middle. We can look and see what her sexual behavior and contraceptive use look like in this week. And we can compare it to all of the other weeks that she was in the study and see if it looks the same or different. We're also able to lag the effects, so we're able to say a homicide occurred last week. What does her behavior look like this week? Does that differ from all the other weeks in the survey? All right, so now to get to the results. Do neighborhood homicides increase the risk of pregnancy? We find that yes, they do. Women are more than 250% more likely to conceive in a week when they've been exposed to a nearby homicide than a week when they have not. This is a pretty dramatic increase. I do want to reiterate that we have a small sample size, which can also sort of inflate the estimate, but I do think that this is real. Across the 4 types of specifications, we find pretty consistent effect sizes in terms of magnitude and significance. And if we look at the lagged effects, we do find that the effect of homicide seems to be really concentrated in the specific week in which the homicide occurred. And then as you move out in time, so a homicide occurred 8 to 14 days earlier, 15 to 21 days earlier, 22 to 28 days, these become less statistically significant and also start becoming more and more negative. All right, so what are the behavioral mechanisms that homicide might be operating through? So the first one, obviously, is sexual behavior. Much to my surprise, and to my co-author's surprise, homicides appear to have a negative effect on sexual behavior. So women were 5 percentage points less likely to have sex in a week when a homicide occurred. However, in terms of their contraceptive use, we do find pretty consistent negative effects on contraceptive use. So women were 15 percentage points less likely to say they used any form of contraception. They were 14 percentage points less likely to say they used a hormonal form of contraception. Although not significant, consistent with these findings, they were 7 percentage points less likely to say that they used coital contraception. And with respect to contraceptive consistency, sorry, I don't know what happened to the labels, women were 15 percentage points less likely to use contraception consistently if they had sex and used contraception at all, and a homicide occurred in that week, relative to all other weeks when they had sex and used contraception, but a homicide didn't occur.
Are all those significant?
So this is marginally significant, both of these are significant, and this is marginally significant.
And they come from the fixed effects linear regressions?
Yes, but they exhibit very similar magnitudes and significance with the logistic. Also, so I'm not going to show you the lagged effects here because it's redundant, but they exhibit the exact same pattern here. So for across all of those behaviors, any significant effect we find is really happening in this first 7 days. After that, it disappears. So to briefly summarize, young women's risk of conceiving a pregnancy increases substantially in weeks when they are exposed to a homicide within a quarter mile of their house. This effect, however, is short-lived. And the uptick in pregnancy appears to be primarily driven by reductions in contraceptive use, both with respect to any contraception and with respect to using contraception consistently. Now, for the complicated part of this story, I believe that when you combine the reductions with sexual intercourse and the reductions in contraceptive use, what's happening is that women are attempting to abstain, and in the failed cases of abstention, women are having sex without contraception and getting pregnant. And I have additional sort of psychosocial evidence of this that I can show you during the Q&A, but I just want to lay out this argument here because it's slightly complicated and more straightforward than, oh yes, homicides made everyone have sex and then they all got pregnant. I don't think that's what, obviously that's not what happened. Okay, so just a brief caveat. I have low statistical power, so that poses a problem both with estimate precision and finding statistically significant results, but also in terms of magnitude. It's possible that we're estimating large effects because of such small heterogeneity. Also, currently, we are focusing specifically on homicides, and this may downwardly bias our estimates by overlooking potentially other egregious offenses like aggravated assault. And finally, the thing that's most frustrating to me is that with any kind of causal analysis, we really don't know with any certainty about the actual mechanisms. And that is, I think, sociologically very interesting. So what are the broader implications of these findings? Okay, this is what Pat Sharkey refers to as the long reach of neighborhood violence. So by long reach, I mean sort of these unintended, longer lasting consequences of neighborhood violence. And I think when we think about the consequences of neighborhood violence for young adults, they're different than the consequences for younger children and adolescents. So, for instance, as I've shown you today, neighborhood homicides contribute to an elevated risk of getting pregnant at a young age. And as I'm sure all of you can imagine, and some of you actually know firsthand, pregnancy and subsequent childbearing have an enormous bearing on women's subsequent physical, economic, and social trajectories. So here's just sort of the small model the simplified model that I showed you earlier. But now we're moving to also think about these other potential mechanisms that may be at play here to sort of get at the more nuanced ways in which the transition to adulthood is a particularly pivotal time for neighborhood homicides to sort of have an undue influence. Even if the effects of neighborhood homicides wear off over time, given the fact that they affect pregnancy, and as we're also finding in our other studies, affect things like cohabitation, these consequences can be really enduring. Also, I want to reiterate, although I didn't mention this at the beginning, that of course, as Kathy Eden has shown, there are lots of reasons why women with different socioeconomic and racial backgrounds prefer pregnancy at earlier ages. However, nonetheless, early family formation is one major contributor to social stratification. Women who get pregnant and have children at early ages are much more likely to subsequently become separated from their spouse and then to become a single parent. Also, given the effects on their subsequent educational attainment and earnings, early pregnancy is associated with subsequent poverty and diminished human capital. So as I mentioned at the very start of this talk, neighborhood homicides are likely to have broader effects beyond those specifically on pregnancy. So the other two that my colleagues and I are interested in exploring are relationship commitment and cohabitation, as well as college enrollment and completion. All of these may be interrelated and ultimately affect social and economic stratification in a way that aligns with our belief that neighborhood homicides have this particularly influential effect when they occur between the ages of 18 and 24. Thank you.